Welcome to the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee on hearing SAO Performance Audits, State Auditor's Office Performance Audits. This is January 7th, 2026, and the week before the legislative session begins, so we appreciate being able to get this hearing in advance of the legislative session. And today, the staff from the State Auditor's Office are presenting the results of the State Auditor's Office report on expanding use of pretrial services in Washington. The performance audit was conducted solely and independently by the State Auditor's Office under the authority of legislation approved by voters in Initiative I-900. The State Auditor is elected directly by the people of the state of Washington. The office operates independently of the legislature and the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee, which is JLARC. JLARC members, if we have several online, please let me know if you have a question or comment. If it's a question just clarifying, we'll ask just for a clarifying question to interrupt the presentation. Otherwise, let's hold questions until the end of the presentation. And after the presentation, we will be also hearing from agency representatives from Spokane Municipal Court and Grays Harbor County District Court and Yakima County. After we hear from agency staff, we will also open up for any public testimony on the audit. And as a reminder, again, the JLARC, the committee, does not act formally on the State Auditor's Office reports. We receive them and are legally obligated to hold a hearing, and this is kind of the entree into the legislative process for the State Auditor's performance reports, which are invaluable. Although it's a separate constitutional entity, it's an invaluable part of accountability for state government, and we thank them for this. So with that, we will proceed directly to ask the State Auditor's staff who are presenting today to come forward and introduce yourselves, and then the floor is yours, or the microphone is yours. I will say, just for the record, since it may not show up otherwise, Representative Stephanie Barnard is with us online. And do we have any other members? Okay. So Secretary Representative Ed Orcutt is here in person with me, Chair Jerry Paulette. Thank you. And please introduce yourselves. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. My name is Kayvon Zadeh, and I was the Principal Performance Auditor overseeing this audit. With me today are Aaron Catterlin and Claire Nakayama, who conducted work on this audit. We're here today to present on our audit on expanding the use of pretrial services in Washington State. Before we get started, I would like to thank the Administrative Office of the courts and the various courts that we worked with in the course of this audit work. Their work was invaluable in informing us of understanding of this topic. We have 4 key audit results we'd like to talk about today. The first is that most local courts that we interviewed would like to implement or expand pretrial services, but face barriers to doing so. The second is that analysis of data from the Washington courts that we evaluated, 3 of them, showed variation in the use of pretrial services and potential disparities in pretrial release. Third, although having high-quality, accessible pretrial data is important for evaluating pretrial outcomes, most selected courts did not collect this data in an accessible format. And fourth, research suggests various strategies for jurisdictions wishing to implement or expand pretrial services, which we'll discuss at greater length in the course of this presentation. With that, I'll hand things off to Erin Catterlin, who will discuss the audit background as well as our key audit results.
Thank you, Kayvon, and Chair, members of the committee. My name is Erin Catterlin, and I was a performance auditor on the team. Sorry. I'm going to start our presentation today by walking you through the background of pretrial services in Washington as well as the court system. Washington law and court rules presume that a person charged with a criminal offense will be released on their own personal recognizance prior to trial. And traditionally, judges have some options as alternatives to detaining defendants as they await trial. Defendants can either be released on their own recognizance, required to pay bail to be released, and the last option that has received some increased focus in the last decade or so is releasing defendants with pretrial services. Pretrial services are certain conditions of release offered by judges at any point during before the defendant's trial. And although pretrial services can be provided as an alternative to bail, in many cases, courts offer them in addition to bail rather as just an alternative. Washington has a decentralized court system with more than 300 independent courts. And there's no law or judicial rule requiring courts to offer pretrial services. And because of this, the use of pretrial services is left up to the discretion of each independent court. The Administrative Office of the Courts, or AOC, provides support for Washington's local courts in a variety of services. And although AOC is not directly involved in administering pretrial services, it received funding within the last 2 biennia for a pretrial services pilot program to help courts expand the use of these services. And we'll discuss the details of this pilot program a little bit later in our presentation. In 2019, our office conducted a performance audit that found pretrial services can be comparable to bail in maintaining public safety and estimated that it could save the taxpayers between $6 million and $12 million per year. In the same year, the Pretrial Reform Task Force recommended courts implement a wide variety of pretrial services to maximize the number of defendants eligible for pretrial release. In addition, studies that we reviewed during the course of the audit found that pretrial services can help address disparities in pretrial releases for low-income defendants, as well as those in racial and ethnic groups at greater risk for pretrial detention. To follow up on these prior recommendations, we wanted to conduct an audit that would determine the extent to which Washington courts are using pretrial services, and that would also identify potential disparities in pretrial release, barriers to implementing pretrial services, and actions Washington courts could take to increase the use of pretrial services. We also wanted to provide a status update on the Administrative Office of the Courts pretrial service program, or pilot program. To answer these audit questions, we selected 14 courts from 7 different counties from across the state. We chose these courts based on a variety of factors, such as the size of their pretrial population, the location of their courts. We also wanted to make sure that we had some courts that had implemented pretrial services as well as some that had not, so we can learn about barriers, potential barriers to implementing these services, as well as any strategies to mitigate those barriers. The first thing we wanted to look at was which types of pretrial services the selected courts were using and whether these services offered were in line with leading practices. So in our research, we identified a few categories of services that are shown to result in effective outcomes and community safety. The first being supportive services. Services in this category focus more on providing referrals to community services that can help address some underlying needs of each defendant. And these include things such as employment and housing services, as well as drug and alcohol treatment. The next is assistance services. These services focus on logistics of making sure defendants are aware of and can attend all court appointments. These include providing defendants subsidies for transportation like bus and rail or transit passes, but also can include notification services like sending defendants court hearing text or email reminders. And the last service type that we identified as a leading practice was supervision. Supervision services can go beyond simply monitoring defendants for violations of release conditions and can include requiring defendants to attend in-person check-ins. We did not include monitoring tools as a leading practice because research on their effectiveness we found was inconclusive. As you can see from the table on the slide, while several of the selected courts offer some form of pretrial services, the most commonly used was monitoring tools, even though we did not consider this a leading practice. And finally, only 2 courts we found that of the selected courts we reviewed provided all the services recommended by leading practices. Next, we wanted to determine how many defendants were offered pretrial services within those selected courts. However, we only received data for 3 of the 14 courts that we selected. Most of the courts could not provide the data because either their system did not include the necessary data fields or the court does not prioritize tracking the pretrial outcomes, or they don't have a formal pretrial services program. And even if they did have a pretrial services program, we found that most do not track referrals and outcomes in an easily accessible format. We found various reasons for these data issues, and the first one was that there are no formalized definitions of what pretrial services can include, which makes it difficult for courts to determine whether any of these services they offer count as pretrial services. There is also no court rule or state law that requires that courts track this type of data. And without this requirement, it's unlikely that courts offering services will collect this data consistently. Lastly, there's no single system or process to collect pretrial services data. Courts that have a formal pretrial program may use different case management systems, and AOC maintains a statewide database for court information, but it does not have dedicated fields for pretrial services information. Now I'm going to hand it off to Claire to take you through some of our data analysis results and barriers and strategies for courts looking to implement pretrial services.
Thank you, Erin. Good afternoon. My name is Claire Nakayama, and I'm also a performance auditor on the team. As Erin mentioned, we received pretrial data from 3 courts: Spokane Municipal Court, Spokane Superior Court, and Yakima Superior Court. Spokane Municipal and Superior Courts provided data for all 5 years of our review period, while Yakima Superior provided data for 1 year, 2023. As you can see on the graph, we found that for each year in our review period, the courts reviewed released 30% or fewer of their defendants via pretrial services at least once each year, and that is without the defendant having to post bail. Next, for the 3 courts that provided data, we tested different factors related to both crime and demographics of the defendant to see whether there were any potential disparities in who gets released with pretrial services. For crime factors, including the level and type of alleged crime, criminal history, and history of failure to appear, we found that results were as expected. So the more serious the offense, the less likely that the defendant was to receive pretrial services. We also found that having multiple charges and a history of failure to appear in court for hearings in previous cases both factor into who receives pretrial services. All 3 courts that provided data said that the severity of the crime and judicial discretion play a role in who receives pretrial services. For example, a judge may be reluctant to release someone if their crime is domestic violence. We also wanted to see whether demographic factors like gender, race, or ethnicity affect whether certain defendants are more or less likely to receive pretrial services. When controlling for other factors besides gender, we found that female defendants were more likely to be provided pretrial services at all 3 courts. When looking at potential disparities in pretrial services by race, we found inconsistent results. At Spokane Superior Court, Black defendants were less likely to receive pretrial services, while at Spokane Municipal Court, Asian defendants were more likely to receive pretrial services. Lastly, when looking at ethnicity, we found that Hispanic defendants were less likely to receive pretrial services than non-Hispanic defendants at both Spokane Municipal and Superior Courts. For more on our methodology, you can see Chapter 2 and Appendix B of our report. We also analyzed statewide criminal court data, which indicates that a larger share of Black and Hispanic defendants are charged with more serious offenses, such as Class A felonies, making them less likely to be considered for pretrial services. We did not evaluate potential causes of these demographic differences, but one study suggests that the persistent stereotypes of Black and Hispanic men as criminal or threatening may lead to Black men being more frequently associated with violent crimes and Hispanic men with drug-related offenses. Moreover, a court official shared that historic patterns of over-policing in communities of color mean that they are more likely to be arrested more than once. Now I'm going to touch on the barriers courts face and some strategies we identified to implementing pretrial services. While 10 out of the 14 courts we reviewed said they would like to implement pretrial services or expand what they already have, courts shared 3 main barriers they face to expanding services in their jurisdictions, which are funding, available resources, and public safety concerns. Every jurisdiction we talked to cited funding concerns as a top barrier to implementing or expanding their pretrial services. Court staff also said there are not enough resources in their community to refer defendants to, such as drug and alcohol counseling centers and housing assistance programs. Lastly, some judges and law enforcement officials may be reluctant to pursue pretrial services out of concerns that defendants who are released could reoffend while waiting their trial. However, our office's 2019 audit found that pretrial services can be comparable to bail in maintaining public safety. In our report, we also identified strategies for designing, managing, and funding pretrial services based on a literature review, lessons learned from our selected courts, and pretrial programs in Arizona, Illinois, and Texas. For this presentation, I'll be sharing just a few highlighted strategies for designing a program. For designing, sources recommend establishing a clear framework to outline the mission, purpose, and functions of the pretrial program. This framework could be carried out by a collaborative work group with representatives from, for example, the Sheriff's Office, Police Department, Probation, Public Defense, judges, and the jail director. Another strategy is maintaining a centralized information system to track pretrial data and use mission-driven performance measures. For example, Illinois has a statewide case management system with a public dashboard showing measures such as how many defendants received pretrial supervision that year. This allows them to better communicate their outcomes with the public. We also found that Washington courts fund their pretrial services through various sources, including a city sales tax, non-governmental nonprofit grants, and funds from the AOC Pretrial Pilot Project. Yakima Superior Court, for example, received a 3-year grant from the Pretrial Justice Institute. The nonprofit provided the court with technical assistance and helped them design the program, create data dashboards, and select a risk assessment tool to use. For more on our strategies, you can see Chapter 4 of our report. And now I'll pass it back to Erin to talk about the AOC pilot program and our recommendations. Thank you.
Claire. With funding from the legislature, AOC has taken steps to help local courts implement or expand the use of pretrial services within their jurisdictions. In 2023, the legislature allocated more than $1.4 million to AOC to fund a pilot project for this purpose. $700,000 of this was awarded to 21 courts to help them with their pretrial services strategies, which included hiring additional staff, improving or implementing data collection, and providing training and development. AOC is finalizing their review of the initial pilot and received an additional $1.4 million to continue into the current biennium. AOC plans to use this funding for both pretrial and post-conviction work. Our report includes a full list of recommendations, but in summary, we provide guidance for local courts wishing to implement or expand pretrial services in their jurisdictions. For instance, we recommend local courts conduct outreach with key stakeholders to learn about interests and concerns regarding pretrial programs and funding, consider strategies to help set up pretrial service programs, and we also recommend local courts monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of their programs. We found additional areas where local courts could benefit from some standardized guidance, and we believe AOC is in a good position to develop and deliver this guidance as the central agency for the judicial system, and especially given its current role in administering the pretrial services pilot program. And that concludes our presentation for today, but we would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Let's see if we have any questions. I'm not seeing any questions. I think you've done a very thorough job briefing us. So with that, let's proceed to, I think we have people online who are to answer questions from Spokane Municipal Court, Grays Harbor, and Yakima County. If you're online, would you just raise your hand if you'd like to offer some comments to start with? And great. Okay, so Municipal Court Judge Mary Logan, please introduce yourself, and please, thank you very much for joining us today, and look forward to hearing.
Thank you. I'm Judge Mary Logan with the City of Spokane Municipal Court. I've been on the bench since 2009 and very actively involved in bringing forth innovations to our city and the municipal court, and frankly to the county as well, by way of just by way of reference. I'll make it a little bit brief as to what I'd like to say. Our program, developed by Michael Diamond, who is our Chief Executive Officer for our Community Justice Services Department, which is something we rebranded our probation department because we've moved away from a heavy policing component that probation traditionally has been labeled as. And our pretrial services unit has become quite robust. There are over 100 data points that are collected. So we are data rich and able to then thereby share out in this performance audit. One of the barriers that happened for us in terms of a stellar across the board success rate is indeed one of the issues that many jurisdictions face, which is the funding component. I'm very much in favor of the creation of a standalone pretrial services unit, which is really ideally how they are run in those other jurisdictions that were mentioned by the auditors. They are not a part of the court, whereas in our instance, they are. And I'm also, of course, a big proponent that they are stably financially backed, because it is that whimsy of money that comes in and out and grant funding that is available that actually diminishes any kind of innovations that have a fiscal note that's attached to them, and many of them do. Some don't, but most do, and this one certainly does. The comparability of pretrial services versus bail, and it isn't a versus, they have been shown since 2019 to be a comparable alternative. The problem is publishing that and making sure that the public, that courts, that law enforcement are really well informed that money bail is not the only thing that would ensure somebody to come to court. And at courts of limited jurisdiction, the Supreme Court's court rules require us to consider release. It's considered presumed except in capital cases. So that's at the superior court level. So having a viable alternative and knowing that the PSU allows for that public safety issue that is often raised when alternatives are reached to, more greatly publicized, I think would really enhance the trust and confidence in the public, as well as courts who may be reluctant because, again, of course, as a judge, your greatest fear, you release somebody and something awful happens. Of course, there's no guarantee of that predictability or not, but if you have pretrial services available, we know that can be reduced. I'm going to actually ask Michael Diamond just to touch on a couple of the differences for our program once we had stability, because we have some fairly remarkable statistics that are separate from what have been presented, if that's all right with the committee for that information to be shared.
That'd be excellent.
Mr. Diamond?
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to share information from the Spokane Municipal Court, specifically our PSU unit, which is our pretrial service unit. As Judge Logan was indicating, we had the opportunity through city funding to begin a pretrial service unit in November of 2021. Prior to that, the court went nearly a year without any pretrial service options. And then before that, we had an opportunity to contract with Spokane County District Court for some variations of pretrial services. In November of 2021, we established our pretrial service unit based upon recommended practices and best practices associated with the National Association of Pretrial Service Agencies. And we identified 5 goals for our program. That was to reduce pretrial detention rates, meaning how much time an individual is spending in jail prior to a resolution of that case, reducing failure to appear rates, reducing time to disposition, reducing the use of bail, and ultimately reducing recidivism. And I think in any court or for pretrial service, these are all goals that should be reflected in those programs. Over the last 4 years, we have shown remarkable success. And as Judge Logan indicated, we have 137 data points that we review monthly to make real-time adjustments in the effectiveness of our programs. We've shown a 55.9% reduction of the use of bail, meaning that we have more individuals releasing pre-trial rather than being held in custody. Of those individuals that were held in custody were being held on other jurisdiction holds. So it was not solely the release of the municipal court, but also being held on other county, other city holds, which again will impact data as we review. We've shown nearly a 2-day reduction in time spent in custody from the date of booking and arrest to the date of release. That really affects how much money is being spent by each jurisdiction, as the cost to detain an individual per day can range from $200 to $300. And we've shown a huge reduction in time to disposition with nearly a 30% reduction in time to disposition. Our failure to appear rates are some of the best that I have worked with in the 25 years that I have done this type of work across the state. We've had a 66% reduction in FTA rates. We have an overall pretrial FTA rate of 4.5%, which is, again, a phenomenal review. When you take into consideration, that means that nearly 96% of the population is showing up. We have had a huge impact on law enforcement as we have reduced the number of warrants being issued by the court. And we have also improved our jail population by having more space for more serious charges to be held if necessary. Our most impactful impact has been nearly a 41% reduction in recidivism through a 1-year review of our program. What I would like to point out is, most importantly, the Spokane Municipal Court population is unique. While similar to many organizations and jurisdictions across the state, we have nearly a 97% indigency rate for our population moving through our court. That means that 97% of the population is being screened at or below 125% of the poverty guideline. The majority of our population are homeless, transient, suffering from mental illness, or being substance affected. So to be able to have the success that we've had with such a challenging population really goes to show that a program following this model, utilizing best practices and strategies, could really be effective in any jurisdiction across our state. So I really do appreciate the opportunity to share some of our successes and welcome any opportunity to answer questions that you may have.
Thank you. That data is very compelling. I appreciate your sharing this. I have two questions. The reduction in detention time is, I don't want to make an assumption that I know why that happens. So would you explain for the everyone, including myself, how that occurs rather than waiting for a bail hearing?
Certainly. Our pretrial program, since we went into effect in, again, November of 2021, we strive to do a series of assessments and financial evaluations within 24 hours of anyone being arrested. Within 24 hours, we're assessing risk and needs. The risk that we're identifying is the risk to fail to appear or the risk to commit a violent crime upon release. And we're doing a financial review to ensure that at first appearance, there is representation, and that's been identified through that financial screening. With having more information available to the judicial officer at that first appearance, they're able to make a more informed decision. And anytime that you're able to provide additional information at that initial point, you really have an opportunity to affect change. And as I mentioned earlier, by reducing the use of bail by nearly 56%, that means you have less individuals spending time in custody or in jail, and you are in effect having individuals spend 1 day in jail versus 3 days, 5 days, or 2 weeks, which is the point of their next hearing or their next pretrial conference. So really, it's a combination of the work that we're doing that allows the judicial officers to really make decisions up front in that initial time to say this person would benefit from pretrial services, because our goal is reducing the barriers that affects an individual's ability to return back to court. And that could be, as was mentioned in the SAO audit, bus passes, continual calls, meeting in person, use of electronic monitoring, but we also do a number of social work-oriented services, which is helping individuals find transitional housing, connecting with social workers, connecting with Department of Social and Health Services, and really getting them engaged so that we have a community team working with the court team to affect change and allow the individuals to appear in court rather than being held long-term in custody.
Thank you. Representative Berg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to clarify, did I hear you say that 97% of the folks that come through your court are indigent or eligible at that 125% AMI or less?
That is correct. We actually have a baseline between January 1 of 2016 and January 1 of 2019. We had an 81.49% screening rate for indigency. As of December 28th, 2025, we are at 96.8% indigency coming through our court.
Okay, thank you.
Just interesting, that earlier today on the JLARC staff performance audit relating to ignition devices, we heard Pierce County having a indigency rate for qualified for public defense of 50-something percent, 52%, yeah. I'd like to ask the state auditor's office for kind of how you view information like this, given your recommendation included communicating results to the local decision makers about these investments. And what Mr. Diamond has described for Spokane is clearly, although there are upfront costs that are significant, social workers, everything else, cost savings accrue from having such a dramatic decline in jail detention. Do you have any thoughts in terms of your recommendations about how to communicate this and why officials may not, what are the barriers to understanding the cost savings from the investment?
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's definitely something that we mentioned in the report as one of the strategies, is getting that stakeholder involvement early on, and so we can talk about some of those public safety concerns through the outcomes that people are seeing. And that's also one of the things that we learned through our literature research, was that effectively communicating those outcomes to stakeholders can increase the buy-in from what you're hearing. Yeah.
And I will just add that also that reiterates the importance of data in this arena, because if you're able to speak to the numbers on it, you're able to, I think, allay concerns that folks might have. And
did you, if you would just refresh me from your audit, how successful are local courts in cities and counties in being able to track the data and do any analysis of it?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We did, as we said, receive data for just 3 of the courts that we reviewed, although I will say several of the courts that we reviewed do offer pretrial services to some extent. The data is either hard to track specifically for pretrial data because it's typically containing case docket notes, which are lengthy PDF files. So it's kind of a question of whether they're tracking specifically pretrial data measures for the sake of those outcomes. So that's not always the case, but they are tracking this data to some extent, just not always with the purpose of measuring outcomes for pretrial decisions.
But no one is translating that raw data in some, not no one is, but in some instances there is no one assigned to do that.
In most of the courts.
Most of the courts. Thank you. Yes, we've got another hand up, and Deborah Scott from Grays Harbor.
Hi.
Welcome. Please introduce yourself and share your thoughts.
Thank you for having me. My name is Diana Scott. I work for Grays Harbor County District Court Probation. I've been in this field nearly 30 years. I will echo the thoughts of Judge Logan and Mr. Diamond. The savings is where your people aren't being incarcerated. They're being released. In Grays Harbor County, our 2023 figures estimate the rate of incarcerating a person at $168 a day. So if we're able to put somebody on pretrial supervision or least restrictive alternatives, it definitely saves the county money. I raised my hand because I'd like to speak to the data and tracking data. When you talk about pretrial, you essentially talk about every person charged with a crime. If it's driving while license suspended or shoplifting or something more serious like a domestic violence assault, especially in courts of limited jurisdictions, that's a lot of crimes. To track all that data, we would need 2, 3, maybe 4 people to calculate that. Grays Harbor County also had the benefit of being a recipient of the AOC's pretrial pilot, some funding for that. Our award was specific to putting people on house arrest in lieu of jail, and track that data to see how successful that was. In the, I think it was 26 people that we put on pretrial scram, we only had 1 person reoffend, and so statistically it was the results were favorable. course, we can't slap everyone with alcohol or home monitoring. But we were able to provide some of that data for them. We also received a subsequent award for pretrial work. So Grace Harbor has been, my office specifically, anybody who's incarcerated, whether it be a felony for Superior Court or District Court, even though I work for District Court, we are reviewing their criminal history and doing a science-based risk tool. We use the Ohio risk assessment tool and provide the judges with an indicator whether or not that person's a high risk to reoffend or fail to appear, or moderate or low risk, and to give the judge more information so they're not holding everybody in custody. And so I would just like to say that collecting all the data for all the crimes is a large job, especially for municipal or courts of limited jurisdictions. But I do also think that the state would benefit from having standalone pretrial services departments, which I think the problem is there you're talking money because you need to employ more people. I have a part-time person doing it, and there's just too much work.
Thank you for sharing that important perspective. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else in our online guests who would like to offer comments? Judge Logan, please.
So a couple of things. We're chatting behind the scenes here in Spokane because we have a very robust electronic system. I'll just say that very generally. I am not the wizard of that system, but it is a wizardly system in the sense that it does have the ability to digest that information in a very cost-effective way because it's a part of our system. I am going to call on Mr. Moore, who is online with us, to provide some background about that. And I know that the state is on the move for the courts of limited jurisdiction to have a more robust system so that we're not basically stone and chisel, although frankly, that's my preference, that it's really a system that can more readily gather information and it is very cost effective. Matthew Moore has just shown up, so I would yield to him if that's okay.
Wonderful, please.
Yeah, so my name is Matthew Moore. I'm in IT at the City of Spokane, and I'm in charge of the legal case management system at Spokane Municipal Court, our community justice services, as well as our prosecutor and public defender's office. Our system is a integrated system with all four of those systems talking to each other. So when a judicial officer makes a pretrial decision about what conditions they have, that information is directly entered by the judicial officer most of the time. Sometimes it's the clerks after the fact, but directly into our case management system. And that information is transmitted to our Community Justice Services Department case management system, as well as our prosecutor and public defenders. It allows for us to nearly real-time track conditions of release, bail amounts, as well as it has systems for tracking our breaches of those conditions. So it's an extremely robust system that allows us to collect that data. Now, one of the problems when it came to this particular audit time period was we had transitioned in the middle of the audit timeline. So I believe the timeline was 2019 to 2023. We moved to our new system in March of 2021, tracking most of this information. So we expect to continue to have better data collection as we go forward. I can also speak a little bit to the AOC data storage of pretrial information, as we're also integrated with the state EDR system from AOC. There is no independent storage of pretrial conditions. conditions of release are mixed with post-disposition conditions. So it is very hard to separate that information, and it is very challenging to do analytics based around that stuff. So I really would encourage us to have much better, statewide tracking of these pretrial information if you really want to get good information out.
Thank you. This is probably one of those areas where state budget woes get in the way of doing something that is long-term cost-effective, as I know we've struggled with our funding for AOC. Any final questions from anyone? Thank you for sharing extensive information with us from Spokane and Grays Harbor, and for the staff of the State Auditor's Office for doing a really great public service on this issue with the audit. Appreciate it. With that, the committee meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did we have any public comment? We didn't have any public comment. If people would like to comment, they may provide written testimony on any of today's agenda topics to jlark@leg.wa.gov. That's jlark@leg.wa.gov, or to P.O. Box 40910. That's P.O. Box 40910, Olympia, Washington 98504. All submitted testimony will be distributed to members of the committee and forwarded as well to the State Auditor's Office. Thank you very much, everyone, and now we are double adjourned.